Thanks for joining us for Photo Eye Conversations Live. And tonight we are here in honor of Chris McCaw and his amazing work and his new book. I'm Photo Eye's gallery director, Ann Kelly. To give you a little context of what we're doing here tonight, we're gonna start this off with Chris giving about a 10-minute talk, slideshow, give us a little context for the work. We'll then go into about a 30-minute conversation between Chris and I, and then we'll save the last 15 minutes for a Q&A. Again, we're here in honor of Chris McCaw and his new book. I've got a copy right here, and Chris has one too. And if anybody's interested in checking out the book on our website or would like to add a copy to their collection, if you look at the chat, I have included a link there. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Yeah, thanks everybody for taking the time to hear me do a little summation of 20 years of this project. I've used this slide for every slideshow I've had since I was 18, so it's just a tradition. That's me in about 1986. This is how I got into photography. I was a little skateboarder punk kid in the 80s. I was doing photography with Instamatic, basically a 35mm Holga camera from Time magazine, doing blurry skateboarding pictures of my friends. They all started going to juvie. So my mom got me a Pentax K1000 and I could keep it if I went to the Sunnyvale Community Darkroom to take basic black and white photography. And I was 13 and I got hooked. I grew up in the very late part of the 70s skate parks. They were all closing when I was able to really start skateboarding. So during the 80s, we mostly had to improvise and build weird stuff. And somehow we convinced people's parents to let a bunch of 14 and 15-year-old kids and 16-year-old kids build stuff like this. And because of this, this kind of do-it-yourself thing through punk and skateboarding, I translated all those things and also my junior high woodshop class, because they had woodshop in junior high when I grew up, into building a view camera in 1995. I was self-taught for about the first 5 to 6 years. And then once I went to junior college, I learned about view cameras. And then I sold all my fisheye lenses for different formats and bought a lens that would cover 7x17 film format. And I just was a contact printer for about 8 years and printing in platinum. So basically for about 8 years, I was photographing on 7x17 sheet film and then printing in platinum, making work all over the place. But for a while, I was doing these night exposures. And I don't wear a watch. So the whole thing was I'd open the lens up when the sun went down. And if I could wake up before sunrise to close the shutter, I got it. If not, oh well. And 2003, this happened. We had polished off a handle of Jim Beam, and I woke up around 9 in the morning. Just long enough for the sun to rise. I happened to point the camera east. I had the lens wide open to get as many stars as possible. I was focused at infinity. And once the sun got through the atmosphere, the lens essentially became like a magnifying glass, like you'd focus the sun with a magnifying glass to set a leaf on fire or something. But it was happening inside the camera. I did not know this was happening until later that day when I was downloading my film and there was a tear in one of the sheets and I was thoroughly confused, but I was also hungover. So I got home, I was developing the sheets of film from that trip, and I got to that sheet. I'm like, there can't be anything on here. I don't know what happened. I developed it. The film had solarized, true solarization, not the Sabatier effect, like Man Ray or whatnot, where you're turning the lights on in the dark room while the print is in the developer or film is in the developer. This is reversal of tonality through extreme overexposure. And so basically what I had was a piece of film that was like a very muddy black and white transparency. But being a photographer, I had a piece of film. What do you do with your film? You make prints. So I made a contact print. And that reversal of a positive piece of film when I made a print gave me a negative image. And I struggled for about 3 years burning film and making prints and being confused by this, but fascinated by it. I'll fast forward a few years more, and I started putting black and white silver gelatin paper into the view camera directly, and directly burning that piece of paper. I used to work at a black and white photo lab in the mid-90s, working the graveyard shift, running 5 enlargers at once. And when I left, they had all this old paper that they were throwing out, and I took it. And I sat on it for about 10 years. And then I finally started putting this old paper into my film holders. And through experimentation, out of about maybe 400 pounds of paper, I got 3 boxes that really worked. And then through time, I finessed the developer using different restrainers and able to get stuff like this. And this happens to be, this is in the book. This is actually Sally Mann's house on her property there. With that, I got bigger sheets of paper. People started donating paper to the cause, and I needed to build bigger cameras. At the time, I was living south of Market in San Francisco in this little 1-story on the first floor flat, and I lived with a bike messenger, and our living room was a wood shop. You work with what you got. In any case, I built these ridiculous cameras. This is a 30 by 40-inch camera on the right. It's built on a garden wagon because there's no tripod to really support that I could move around by myself. I also started getting into bizarre optics from old aerial reconnaissance cameras. The camera on the left, that lens is from a U-2 spy plane I got off of eBay for $950. It probably cost the government $500,000. And it weighs about 130 pounds, and I had to put it on a wheelchair, and it uses a car jack to raise and lower the lens. Basically, I have the woodworking skills of a junior high kid who built skateboard ramps. There is no finished brass. There's no hand-rubbed teak oil finish. It's meant to be used in the field. It's going to get screwed up. It's going to get rained on. It's going to sit in the sun all day. So they're kind of rough and ready cameras. And, you know, I think people see this and like, this is crazy. We have iPhones, we have digital cameras. And I just want to remind people, this is nothing. That was with glass plates. That's crazy. So in any case, through using various optics, I was able to get lenses that were exponentially faster than traditional photographic lenses and would cause ignition of the black and white paper in the camera to happen almost instantaneously. And you got to remember that in a view camera, the image is upside down and backwards. So imagine this in the camera upside down. So what looks like to be dripping, that's actually heat and smoke rising off of the burning, cooking the gelatin off of the paper. And so for many years, I slowly perfected this method of photography that broke every rule I was taught, to photograph right into the sun with the lens wide open for hours at a time. Basically, I have the history of photo paper from about 1950 to the late 90s. And the sweet spot is pretty much the 70s and 80s. I think maybe there's more silver in the paper. Also, they had trace elements they had to remove for environmental purposes. But there's something about these papers from that time period. Anything earlier, I bet would have worked, but they were just a little too far gone. Once you get past 1950 and earlier, there's just no blacks, no contrast at all. But in any case, I'm making images like this, and in the book, there's a mix of work that I've been doing since my first book called Sunburn came out 12 years ago. And I'd make pieces like this and notice that the tide would change. There was this other natural cycle that was happening that the paper was recording. And so for a couple of years, I pointed the camera down, and there's only one paper that recorded this in this way. But what I'd do is I'd set up the camera at low tide, focus on the exposed landscape, and then open the lens and let the tide slowly come in, and the landscape would slowly get consumed by water. I was always a big fan of the photographer Win Bullock and his work with tides, and this is kind of an homage to him. Then things got weird. I learned more about the angle of the sun during different times of the year, in different spots on the planet. I would go to the equator where the sun would rise perpendicular off the horizon line. Later, I'll show you some work from Alaska. And so I started doing these double exposures, and I call them heliographs, which means to write with light. And I know it's not a heliograph. I know what a heliograph is. It's made out of asphalt. But I was using the word heliograph as an expression of the gesture of the sun writing, making these abstractions. And what you're looking at here is 6 months in between exposures. You have the low angle that's going from one side of the paper to the other. That's in the winter. That's near the winter solstice on San Juan Island up by the Canadian border. And then I waited 6 months. I marked where the horizon line was. And then in the summer in San Francisco, that more vertical line is the trajectory of the sun around the summer solstice in San Francisco over the Pacific. And I just used a body of water in the foreground as the common thread there. And when I was making these, I've stopped making them because it's really hard to commit film holders to hold the sheets of paper for so long. And then also my ground glass became a mess of notes of all the different exposures I was working on. I thought you also might like to look inside the camera. Because I'm solarizing paper, I'm able to get away with murder in terms of light leaks. I actually have a hole in the bellows that vents the smoke out. If you don't, then it's like photographing through fog and you lose all contrast. But with that hole, I was able to stick my phone in the camera. This is actually a heliograph piece. It's the second exposure. If you look at the mountain range, you'll see a wider mountain range. That's a printout from the very first exposure. So I can see the first exposure, and under safe light conditions, I can open the film holder and look and mark and measure and translate that to the ground glass in case I'm not sure about my notes. Also, while you're out there photographing all day, you have a sketch pad and you come up with other weird ideas. This is, my friends call it the fly. It's got 63 Pentax M f2 50 millimeter lenses, the lens that came on every Pentax K1000, the most manufactured, cheap 35 millimeter manual camera that exists. And this represents 6 months of typing in on eBay broken Pentax 35 K1000 or Pentax M 50 millimeter lens. And the inspiration for this was Edward Muybridge, his motion studies. And I was going to do, instead of animal locomotion, I was going to do solar locomotion. And it just so happened that it takes 63 lenses to cover a 20-inch by 24-inch sheet of paper. I made the path of the sun moving through all the lenses, and I made one, and then I realized there was way more to do with this camera than that. They all have apertures on them. So what's kind of interesting about this piece, if you look at the very far corners of this, those are the lens stopped down to f22, and you can see this whole piece was made in 30 seconds. And you can see the edges, the landscape's in negative still. The sun has kind of solarized into a white sun, but as you get closer to the center, the apertures slowly open up. So, and the very center lens is at an f2. So this kind of shows you the phases of solarization in a way. I thought it would be interesting for the eye to negotiate 63 image circles. This is the sun setting in the Mojave. Basically, all the lens caps were on. The top right corner, I took the lens caps off before the sun moved into the frame. And then as the afternoon went on, I would do these diagonal rows of taking off the lens cap until the very end. The bottom left is just at dusk. And then I let it sit there for a bit. Just dealing with abstraction and all these image circles. Okay, Alaska is a huge part of this body of work. I took an astronomy class in 1990, basics of astronomy, and learned about the midnight sun, and it always stuck with me. And in doing this work, that kind of became the top of the list, is to get 24 hours of daylight burned through. It just so happens you can drive to the Arctic Circle. It's about 4,000 miles, 3,500, 4,000 miles each way. It's a pretty cool trip. Basically, you get to Fairbanks and then you get on the oil pipeline service road. It wasn't open to the public till I think 1996 or 97. I highly recommend it. I've been up there 4 times. The last trip I was actually in the Arctic Circle for 5 weeks, and you really get the sense that you're spinning around on a marble and the sun's just going around you all day long. I bought a van for Alaska because the sun was going to be up 24 hours a day. I needed basically a changing tent so I can change out paper. I can black out the windows. It's not a wet dark room, but it's a portable changing room. It has safe lights in the ceiling, but it also serves as sanctuary during maybe a week and a half of snow or grizzly bears. You name it. The first time I went, I realized I can't use traditional 8x10 or 11x14 or 20x24 if I want to capture 24 hours of daylight. You need to use a really pretty wide angle lens and to get the high point of the sun. And once you do that, you deal with a ton of distortion. And I can hear my girlfriend saying, don't talk about lens distortion. So I'm going to avoid that and basically say I made a panoramic format and tilted it on its side. This camera is on the right here is 12 inches. I happen to get a 40-inch roll by 100 feet of paper that solarizes well. So I made a 12-inch wide by 40-inch camera format. The wagon is sitting on a homemade Lazy Susan, essentially, so I can pivot around. And this was actually during the making of this next piece I'm about to show you. And this is the last big multiple panel piece I made in Alaska. This is in 2015. This is actually a double midnight. Because these are paper negatives, it's backwards. So you don't read it left to right, you read it right to left.
What is the length of that exposure?
Double midnight. The low points are the midnights. I want to say it's like 35 hours, something along those lines. It's in the book. I'm starting to lose all the details.
But that's a long exposure. We're not looking at a few hours. We're looking at over a day.
Yeah, but each panel only sees a few hours of exposure. I actually have 2 film holders, so when I put the first film holder in and expose it, I have a second one loaded, and then the little spots those little vertical lines are these little spaces in between of pure panic to close the lens, put the dark slide in, pull the film holder out, put the ground glass, slide the ground glass into the camera, open the lens up, mark where the sun is, mark where the landscape is, transfer those measurements to the other side of the ground glass, turn the camera, level it, make sure the focus hasn't shifted, put the other holder in, put the lens cap on, pull the dark slide, take the lens cap off, and then you wait for another couple hours. And in the meantime, you take the first film holder into the van to change the paper, to get a fresh sheet of paper. It's a full body experience. And then what's great about this piece too is the very center, there was a huge storm that came through just out of nowhere. So you'll see these vertical drips. It's kind of probably hard to see on the screen, but that's actually rain getting into the camera. And the line is all offset because the wind was throwing the camera all over the place. And when the storm finally went through, it was settled at a different angle. So the middle frame is kind of documenting weather as well. And then this piece gives you a sense of how big it is. It's 25 panels, each one a foot wide. So it's 25 feet long, and these are made out of in-camera paper negative. I should say too that I'm really strict. I don't crop anything. There's nothing in post except maybe I'll run something through bleach if the paper's super fogged after the fact. But otherwise, there's no cropping. The way I photograph things especially with the Sunburn process, is kind of like one of those long Scorsese tracking shots where everybody has to walk perfectly through everything. If it doesn't work, you start all over again. But for me, I'd have to start over the next day. I'm always looking at the history of photography, and I learned about Cirkut cameras a long time ago. I was always fascinated with them. It's a view camera that does what your iPhone panoramic camera thing does, except it's a view camera that uses a 10-inch roll of film that's 20 feet long. Usually they were used for group photographs, and the prints would be 10 inches tall by 4 feet wide. And those are contact prints. And I was always fascinated by that. So what I did is I constructed scrolls of paper in the darkroom here in Pacifica, California. and put them in tubes. And I did this artist residency in North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's called Castle House. And they worked with me to connect me to the astronomy department at UNC that happens to have their own machine shop because they service a radio telescope in Chile. And they helped me convert this literally, it was a 1913 Cirkut camera. And then in 2013, we took out the wind-up motor and they helped me put in a stepping motor so it could track the sun via battery and solar panel for as long as I was able to stay awake. And so this is the camera in action in the Arctic Circle. That's midnight right there. And as the camera turns, it pulls the scroll of paper past a 1/4-inch wide slit. And the sun, you have to keep the sun projecting through that slit perfectly so that they're in alignment and the line will be recorded onto the paper. And the reason why I did this, not to get into lens distortion too much, but it would create a perfect sine wave form of 24 hours of daylight. And this is what you get. This is actually reproduced in the book. What's beautiful about this is that's different from the regular Sunburn work is that the paper actually only sees about you think it would just be like a clock motor that would turn 360 degrees in 24 hours, but because of the tilt of the Earth, actually you have to slow it down at night and speed it up in the middle of the day. So you got to change the speeds. But generally, most of the paper sees about 10 minutes of time as it passes across that 1/4-inch slit. So it records weather in a very strange way. I will fess up, I did not predict, and I'm fascinated by the movement of clouds. That's what those vertical streaks are. It's kind of hard to see, but if you look down near the horizon line, this is about 60 miles south of Dead Horse, Alaska, basically where the oil pipeline starts. And it's just, at this point, it's just rolling hills of tundra. There's not much of a landscape there. It's just this horizon line as the camera's spinning in a circle. How it recorded weather and this waveform is really special. And this is kind of like the high point for me in terms of Alaska and work. But in any case, just to sum up, I'm just another guy pointing cameras into the sun.
Love it. All right. So, want to talk about the new book, but I want to go back just a little bit. You had a background in building things, skateboard ramps and such, and you wanted a large format camera, but you couldn't afford one, right? So you just decided to make your own.
I sold all my gear and I bought a like 1902 Corona banquet camera that was literally an antique, and I was hiking with that thing, having a heart attack because that was like 3 months rent at the time. Mm-hmm. And so when I graduated, when I got my BFA, I sold that thing and paid my rent and made that camera for about $150.
Right. And so then you felt liberated by, once you managed to build a camera that was functional, the bellow, I mean, it's more than just the woodwork. There's the bellows.
Yeah, I made those bellows too.
Yeah. You had to find the lens and you got pretty creative with the lens, but that actually led to the work, which was kind of a surprise.
I'm totally honest about how serendipity, some people might have just thrown that piece away, that piece of film away. I'm glad I saved it. And
yeah, so you were out camping, you had your camera with your big lens, you're making your long exposure, you fall asleep, you wake up, and your film is burnt, and you almost threw it away because at the time you were not making paper negatives. You were contact printing platinum prints from those negatives, which is why you wanted the big negatives.
Yeah.
But it was
this is before digital negatives. This is where if you wanted a big platinum print, unless you wanted to pull an Irving pen and like make enlarged interpositives and then make an enlarged negative, a large negative to contact print from, which I didn't want to do. I'm like, I would rather just take a heavy camera out in the field and make it simple.
Yeah. But you did make a contact print of that burned negative. I
Yeah.
recall when I visited your studio, you have that print. It's in
Yeah. Yeah.
books. But had you not paid attention, had you not pursued the options, none of any of what you talked about in the slideshow would have ever, you wouldn't have been, I mean, maybe you would have gone to Alaska, but it wouldn't have been the same
Right.
trip.
It's basically completely changed my way of thinking about photography. I can't go back to straight photography. I just can't. Once smoke comes out of your camera, there's no going back. So, um, and
Right.
I think also it has to do with the changing of technology and the making of photographs now. Um, I don't know if I'm just being a little bit of a Luddite, but I love the dark room. I always loved the dark room. I was always mystified when people were like, "Oh, thank God Epson made these printers. I can put it in my darkroom sink, and I don't have to get my hands wet anymore." And I just never understood that personally. I just love that there's still more to be done with the medium. I'm actually doing new work that deals with solarization, doesn't have the sun, but there's just so much more to explore with the medium.
Right. So you're putting vintage silver gelatin paper into these cameras. You're doing really long exposures. A lot of the time, the sun burns actually through the paper. Sometimes it just makes a little bit of a mark. It
Yep.
solarizes it in the process. Could you briefly explain solarization just for anybody that's not?
Sure, sure. I have to say it over and over again because people hear solarization and you think of um what Man Ray did, or where you flip the lights on while it's developing. And that is the Sabatier effect, also known as pseudo solarization, but it won't uh, it's ingrained in the history of photography that you just call that a solarization. But a true solarization is just obliterating a light sensitive material with light till it reaches this threshold and converts into the opposite tonality. And actually, if you keep going, it'll convert back into a negative again, too, if you let it go with a really fast lens for multiple days. Another thing that's kind of serendipitous about all this, happened to using big cameras and have this happen. When I developed that piece of film back in 1994, I took the world's only semester-long daguerreotype class with Jerry Spagnoli. And I learned then about solarization because you do a plate outside, it's very blue sensitive, and the skies would always solarize. They'd be darker in tonality than the rest of the plate. So I knew about that. But then also through that class with Jerry, he taught me about aerial camera lenses because they're faster, because you need a lot of speed to photograph dags. So I had that information in my head that I used, over a decade later.
You mentioned, well, this is a big part, because the sun is actually burning through the paper, your cameras are smoking.
Those heavy ones that weigh like 30 pounds, or that one on the wheelchair is insane. That lens, I've had the reflection on water burn. It's so fast. But if I have a wide angle lens, it doesn't smoke insanely. It's like a little smoldering. There was one story. I was up in the Olympic Peninsula on one of the islands, Indianola maybe, or I don't remember. There's a munitions. The whole island is mostly military, and they store ammunition there, and I'm sure there's missiles there or whatnot. There's a barbed wire fence around most of it, but there's this great view of a south-facing beach, and I was photographing there, and smoke. I was using one of the big lenses. The smoke was pouring out of that wagon camera, right? And Homeland Security came by, and I got a thorough questioning background check as to what the hell I was doing. And I shouldn't have mentioned that some of the lenses I use are radioactive. That was the technology around World War II to get they put thorium in the glass that allowed for lens designs that gave you a couple more stops, and they didn't really care that it was radioactive. It was war. Um, so I have hot glass in the van, and crossing borders is a huge pain in the butt. I always go to secondary because I set off the radiation alarms. But I mentioned that to the Homeland Security guy, and he didn't like that either. So
That probably didn't help.
no.
When there is a lot of smoke, do you have a technique to clear the smoke?
There's a little solar panel with a little 12-volt computer fan that I put in the hole of the bellows, and it has this kind of light baffle thing, so light can't get in, but it vents the bellows. And it's just something I never thought I'd ever have to deal with photography. That, and also like sometimes the wagon gets a flat tire during the exposure, and then it's just weird stuff I never ever thought I'd have to deal with photography, and I love it because it's this tangible thing. I feel like I'm really working with the medium in just this super tactile way.
Or how important do you feel like curiosity is in art making? Do you think curiosity feeds that?
I think, yeah, for everybody, yeah, I'd say that's the main motivation, right? And for me, it's I just my thinking is a little more out there, but not unlike what other folks are doing. I think there's a huge number of people exploring the medium and thinking about what is possible, what hasn't been done yet. And it's exciting. It's exciting to explore and experiment, fail, lots of failure, but that's okay.
It's part of the journey, right?
Yeah, yeah. Like when those astronomy students were helping me convert that camera, that Cirkut camera, and I drove my van to North Carolina. They'd been working on it for a couple weeks. We went to the roof of the building, set it up, and it didn't work. And the professor, Christopher Clemens, or he's the dean of astronomy and physics there, and he's like, "How's it going?" I'm like, "Not happening." He's like, "Excellent," because that's how. And I was like, "That's excellent. That's kind of a bummer, but that's how you learn. Yeah, you learn through failure. Yeah, which is fun. I don't know. There's no rush. This work has slowly evolved. I never would have come up with from the very beginning, oh, I'm going to burn paper. I'm going to make a camera with 63 lenses. I'm going to convert a 100-year-old panoramic camera. I'm going to do all this stuff. It just kind of evolved over time, and I let it take time. I don't rush it. So,
Well, I think that's important, not to rush.
yeah.
So let's talk about this book here.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful book. I will add Photo Eye's owner and founder, Rickson Reed, did pick this as one of his favorite books of the year on our annual favorite book list that came out in end of the year. You can find that on our blog. So this is not your first book. You've published a few books.
This is my second book. The first book came out called Sunburn with Candela Press in Richmond, Virginia. My buddy Gordon. That was 2012. So I was already in about 6 years burning paper, and I had gone to the equator. I'd been to Alaska, and I was able to get 24 hours of daylight. There was even an eclipse about 2 months before the book was printed, so I got to squeeze those pieces into the book. But then, yeah, then it's been 12 years, and this book kind of represents where the work has gone since then, how it's evolved.
So can you tell us a little bit about the process of making a book? That's something a lot of people are always curious about.
Uh,
Find how you found the publisher,
right.
selecting the images. Were you on press?
The first book I was on press. It was absolutely terrifying, and one of the reasons why I liked working with Datz Press and Sangyeon and Seoul in South Korea. Their books are just immaculate, and I knew if I just gave them the files, they were going to do an excellent job. They had printed a couple little things before, and their attention to detail is insane. But I really, there's people who make books every couple years. They have a project to make a book. I actually hate making books. I find the whole process completely stressful. I make photographs. I'm not a book designer. I know that. I know my limitations,
But when you can collaborate with people that are good at these things, that's
Yeah, like when they said we want to show all this work, I'm like, oh, I thought you might have picked just one aspect of where it's gone. And they're like, no, we see the thread throughout it. And something that I felt very insecure about, but once I've seen it, it really does kind of, it works. Doing a book is extremely stressful, and there's a reason why it took 12 years to wait till I did a second one. But I'm really happy with it. I wasn't on press. They did something I didn't even know existed called, because they're black and white images, but because of those little moments of cooked gelatin, there's these oranges and reds that happen. So it has to be printed in color. So they did something with this uncoated paper stock that's really got a nice feel to it, and it's CMYKK. They did an extra black. I didn't know you could do that. That made me really nervous, but it really worked and it looks beautiful.
well, I was gonna say, so with work like yours that is basically a physical object, it's very tactile. There's always kind of that question of how does that even work as a book? But
Right.
the way that, and I wish everybody could see this, the way these are printed, I mean, it doesn't look necessarily like the image is tipped on, but almost. I mean, it actually kind of feels not like the real print, but I don't know if it's the printing you mentioned or the paper, the
Yeah.
combination, but it's really lovely.
It's thanks. Yeah, it's just they did a great job. And that's one of the things too about doing a book. When I'm all my work's unique, I don't do prints. I don't do any reproductions. So what's really hard is sometimes, you have a show in one city and just those people get to see it. And if work gets sold, that work's gone.
Right.
And I
It's
don't necessarily know who has it, actually. The gallery's closed and all that information is lost. So, but I scan everything before I send it out. So, but this is a book I know they're all unique objects and they really do need to be seen in person. I highly recommend that. I like that these kind of they look kind of dumb on a computer, but there's certain images that like I say I brought to the gallery saying, I want this piece to be in the show. This is in the show. And they sell it before, it's a good problem to have, but they sell it before the opening and nobody sees it. And it's like my favorite, the best work I've ever made, and it's gone. And there's a few of these in the book that I wanted to share.
not that this is the same as seeing the real thing, but I do have
Oh, yeah.
a print here, and this is one where it's burnt.
Oh, do you know what's crazy? That's in the Mojave, and that tree is gone. That whole area burned last year.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it all burned to the ground. It's really sad. So that's kind of a uh let's see, even more unique piece now. Yeah, there was a forest fire. All these jasper trees burned down in the eastern Mojave. Yeah.
Well, if anybody's around, come see this in person because I don't know how it looks on the computer screen, but can you get a sense of the burn a little bit? I don't know. You got to come in and see it, but we have them here.
Yeah.
So I do need to ask real quick because there is, yeah, a little bit of color in the work. It's very minimal, but it's based upon the heat. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just the cooking of the gelatin in the paper. And so you'll get these oranges or reds, depending on the paper. The surface is it glossy, is it matte? It changes. And yeah, so there's that aspect to it too. Also, each paper has its own tone to it. Some are warmer, some are cooler. Sometimes the restrainers I use give a color shift too. So they aren't really, they're black, they're mostly monochromatic, but they aren't totally monochromatic.
Just a little. Well, you were talking about having the history of photography paper in your studio. I mean, that's because you have all of these different types of papers because they yield different results, right?
Yeah. And I'm on eBay every morning and Craigslist. It's getting harder though. People like it was great when I first started. People were like, "Oh, just take it. I got my Epson printer, man. I'm done. This stuff's old anyways. It's all fogged." I'm like, "Awesome." And now it's when something interesting shows up on eBay, it's tricky. Um I don't say what papers I use. I'll just say I like blue boxes, I like some orange ones, and some yellow ones.
Look, I found a forum online the other night, and there was some guy asking what paper you were using because I guess he'd been attempting the process and just kept ending
Yeah.
up with black sheets of paper.
I'll give you a hint. Don't use Ilford.
Okay.
Any generation of Ilford. It just does not solarize. Yeah.
And the newer papers as well, right?
I have not found a paper that works. And actually, part of me, I stopped, to be honest, I actually stopped looking kind of right before COVID. When new papers would come out, I try them. I've stopped. I kind of like the search. I like the fact that like this orange box of paper does this amazing stuff, and it's the same paper Richard Mizrak used to make those desert night photographs that were split toned. And he was never able to fully realize all the additions because the orange box changed the formula of the paper and it wouldn't split anymore. But I'm using paper that splits. I don't know. It's like there's this weird connection to the history of photography that I really love. And all these surfaces, there's double weight, there's premium weight, there's single weight, there's A weight, also known as document weight, which is there's no varietal layer. You can fold the paper, it won't crack. It accepts ink. That's what it was meant for. But it's just this. There was such like if you think about in the 70s, 80s, 60s, there were so many more options for photographic paper to choose from besides glossy or matte and all double weight. Yeah.
So, do you have any advice for anybody here who's maybe looking to publish a book? First steps?
I don't know, man. It's hard. It's tricky. And I think most books are it's so funny. Like when I do a book, somebody's like, so what kind of royalties are you getting from the sales of this? I'm not getting anything. I'm lucky enough that I just had to produce a special edition, and that was my only uh, pay in to help produce the book, which is pretty standard. It's expensive to make the books. There's no way around it, and it's not a for-profit endeavor any way, shape, or form. You're doing it because you love the work and you want it to be documented and you want to share it with people. But it's a rough road.
You really have to want to do it, right?
Yeah, I don't mean to sound like a total dream killer, but it's a hard one.
Well, I mean, it's to be taken seriously, and you want to be ready. You don't want to just run out there and do it right away. You you had 12 years worth of work built up
Yeah.
in between, and so you have 12 years worth of work, maybe more, all in this book
Yeah.
here. So again, since maybe it got a little bit lost, I'm gonna add a link to the book in the chat. Maybe I can get it to send. So we have a few questions from our audience here. Let's see here. So first one here. Love all of your solar work. Do you also have any of the earlier works that you can share here, meaning photographs made at night?
Uh,
I mean,
they
maybe you might not have it handy, but
no, they're kind of deep in the flat files.
but
So
but they exist.
they exist. Yeah. There's some they're platinum prints. They're 7 by 17 inch hand coated platinum and platinum palladium.
So here's a related question. Besides the sun, have you ever photographed other stars, galaxies, etc., or do you want to?
I've done the moon. I've done the moon, and I've gotten it's the exact opposite. It's not bright enough. It's just a negative image on a white field. It's they used to make these star maps, photographic star maps, where white skies with black stars. And that's essentially what they look like. I do have one paper. If it's super clear and it's a full moon, I can get the moon to solarize from being black to white. But I'm still working on that. But I don't. I do like one of those. Usually I'm exhausted by the end of the day from photographing all day. So The night stuff is kind of like if I still got a little gas in the tank, I'll do it, but usually not. There's I want to say there's probably 15 competent images of night. I don't really do that many of them.
The sun's worn you out already.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's another one. Do you scout locations? Any of your locations you'd like to do next?
Yeah, I definitely scout locations all the time. Usually when I get to a spot, I have to be there a day. I mean, this is before the phones and stuff and apps. I used to just get there and go, okay, the sun just set there, see where it rises in the morning, and get acquainted with the space a little bit more. And then the next day, I would make work, usually. And that's another aspect of this work that's totally changed. Like it's nothing for me to sit all day for many days, sometimes a week in the exact same spot, which sounds really slow and boring, but it's shocking how fast days go by. And if you feel like you're watching the shadows move. But there's places I've made it to the equator, and that was really, really cool. And I went down there because I knew the sun was gonna rise perpendicular off the horizon. And even once I got there and I looked in the bellows, I was still like super excited that it actually was making a vertical line off the horizon when it appeared in the camera. I'm like, oh, it really does do that. So that was fun. I might want to go back to the equator again. I literally looked at a globe and just spun it around to figure out where the hell I'd go. I wanted the sun to rise over water and maybe set over water. And I was like, at the time I was like, Somalia? But that was right when the pirates were doing the Somali pirates. I'm like, nah. And then it's like the mouth of the Amazon's cool. But I checked the weather, it's usually cloudy. And then Indonesia was pretty cool, seemed pretty cool. But I ended up going to the Galapagos Islands. So I could be on edge of the island and get the sun rising and setting over water.
What about the process of getting the cameras there?
Well, so that I knew I was gonna have to hike and take a water taxi, fly, take a water taxi and hike. So I had a backpack. I had one change of clothes, and then the rest was an 8x10 and a 4x5, one lens each, one tripod each, and then changing 10 and a film holder of each.
Right, because in other situations, you would have the van and you have the
Yeah.
wheelchair ramp, and you can just pack it full of all the cameras. So
Yeah, yeah. Flying to places is hard. Like I do want to go to like Iceland and whatnot, but logistics are tricky, especially if I want to bring a bigger camera.
you need one that breaks down that you can
They
drop
they
a
break they break down so one person can carry a 30x40 camera, but it's really not that much fun. And I don't know, I'm not old, but I'm 52 and it's getting harder. It is actually my back is not stoked on those heavier lenses. Yeah.
So here's another one. Have you ever thought about using color film? Some of the work, especially the last photo from Alaska with weather influences, it reminds me of Morris Louis board paintings.
I don't know that artist, but I would say that I started to dabble with Cibachrome or Ilfochrome, and basically I just didn't like. Well, also one thing they when I started they just discontinued the chemistry, so it was just hard to find chemistry. But I do know another artist, friend of mine, John Chiara, makes these. He's also we're both big beardy, big camera guys in San Francisco, and he shoots usually on Chrome, big sheets. And you'll see in some of his pieces when there's like a water reflection that the brightest parts are actually darker because there's solarization happening. So there is something to be done with Chrome and solarization. I like the simplicity of black and white chemistry, and I decided not to take that path.
You're
There's something to be done with it though.
oh yeah, you're happy with the color you're getting.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
We have somebody asking about the name of publisher, which is Datz Press.
Hmm.
but I feel like we should give them an extra shout out because they
Yeah.
make amazing books. I don't think I've seen a Datz Press book that I didn't love. So
Nice.
I'm sure they were great to work with.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Yeah. They're just their attention to detail and their design sense is great. And the printing is great. And it's all printed. It's not like it's printed in another country and it's got to be on it. I mean, it's all kind of closed loop system of Korea, which is pretty nice.
And there is a San Francisco Art Institute connection, right?
Yeah, yeah. Sangyeon came to San Francisco, went to the Art Institute uh for photography, taught by Linda, was one of her professors, very influential. And I never went to the Art Institute. I couldn't afford it, but Linda was always a huge influence on me. I remember seeing her solo show at SF MoMA in like 1990 or 91 and being blown away by the POP prints. And she's basically my photo. She's declared that she's my photo mother.
Linda's amazing.
Yeah,
She
Linda's awesome.
really cultivated just an amazing photo community in San Francisco, whether you went to the Art Institute or not.
Yeah.
I guess beyond San Francisco.
Oh, definitely.
Here's another question. Are there pieces that you love so much you don't give them to galleries?
Yes. It took me a while to learn that, but yeah, there's this thing called the private collection, personal collection.
Mm.
And there are pieces that I have that are staying with me.
And I imagine you just know those when you see them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those anybody who works in a dark room, you flick on the lights and you're just like, yeah, that's
Mm.
it. And it's such a satisfying feeling. And some of those pieces, I was broke, so I was like, I don't have room to store anything, and there's pieces I wish I had kept, but yeah, there's a handful of pieces like they're staying with me.
I suppose that's probably a little bit like if you end up collecting work by another artist, you just know it when you see it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's kind of the same. You're not that you're collecting your own work, but you're
No, but you get a little weak in the knees, you're like, ooh.
mhm, not willing to part with that.
Mm-mm.
So we have one or two more, but if anybody else has a quick question, you can still drop that in the chat. Um, are you planning on photographing the next solar eclipse in Texas in April?
Okay, so in 2017 was my first totality, and I learned that totality is really totality. Like there's no solarization happening with totality. And it was very stressful. I had made this gigantic 16 by 20 camera that used uh 70-inch R-Tar lens. So basically, to focus at infinity, the lens has to be 6 feet away from the paper. And I made this thing to specifically for the eclipse, and I got it, but I much prefer annular eclipses with the ring of fire around it, where the
Mhm.
moon is slightly smaller than the sun. And so this October, I was out. I was all planned out to be on in Western Nevada, but because of weather, I ended up right at the Utah border in Nevada. But I got a few great pieces of the annular eclipse. I am going to go, I highly recommend, not necessarily for photographic purposes. In fact, it's probably actually when the totality happened in 2017, after it was over, I'm like, I'm never photographing this again, which is probably not true. But I'll probably bring a camera. I can't help myself. But it is, nothing will make you feel more small and meaningless than a total eclipse of the sun. It's very humbling, just how it's hard to describe. I highly recommend trekking out to somewhere from Texas to where it's going all the way into Canada, right? Going through like Ohio and then somewhere through there.
I would imagine at a certain point you maybe don't even want to photograph it just because you want to experience it.
Yeah, yeah. There was a moment there where I had that big camera and I was timing another 11 by 14 and an 8 by 10 at the same time, trying to take the lens caps off. And I felt like I was spinning plates or something. And when really I I was noticing everybody else was just sitting on the ground looking at the sky with their mouth open, and I'm like, that's probably what I should do next time.
That's definitely how I felt my last solar eclipse.
Yeah,
It's recent.
highly recommend it though. Get out there; it's worth it.
All right, we have just a few more. Um, this is prying, but if you only create one image to sell and the book doesn't make money, does your salary come through single image sales or supplement supplement it with residencies and artist residencies, grants, etc.?
Yeah, there is no money in books. No money in books. You're not going to make any money in a book at all. Just going to put that out there. But it does help get the work out there and hopefully sell it. Yes, residencies, grants. I didn't go that route myself. I actually, at 50, I finally retired. I was a custom platinum printer for about 26 years. I actually bought a computer once Dan Burkholder came out with that book in 1995. And so, uh, so I would platinum print back in the day. I used to so I'd platinum print, install art. That kept me my hand into the art world after school, which was great. So I installed at SF Camera Work for 14 years, but then I also would install as a temp at SF MoMA and all these other galleries. Great way to still be you're surrounded by artists and you can get some money. I would photo assist architectural photographers. I'd put on any hat I could to help pay to get a new film holder or that lens that I wanted. And you piece it together. It's hard being an artist. There is no path. It's not like you get a degree and it's like you're a doctor and you're going to do this residency and then you're going to get hired somewhere. It's the Wild West. Nobody's path is ever, no two paths are alike. And definitely residencies and grants are a way to do it. Teaching's a way to do it. I did it through all these various ways.
And
Got
you're
lucky.
you are modest, which I appreciate about you, but the prints are being sold and they're in a lot of important collections now. So I think that's an aspect to it too as well, where the book gets out there and then that raises awareness and then perhaps more print sales. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
that, but
definitely, definitely.
but those prints are in some important collections and private
Yeah,
and
I'm pretty lucky.
oh, here's another one. What's one good moment you wish you could relive and one moment you don't want to experience again while shooting and disseminating your work, etc.? That's a good question.
Okay, the one I don't want to relive again is with the Cirkut camera. There was something wrong with the solar panel, and I started messing with the wiring and shorted out the motor, and that was done. And I cried a little bit.
Mid
Because I was way out there and it was over. And the weather wasn't good. So I'm like, well, I guess I have to go back there next year. That was the worst one.
and then a
Uh,
moment you'd want to relive again because it was so great.
I'm assuming this is photographically.
We'll stick to that. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I could pick just one. I think there's been a few moments where the best part about this for me out of everything is the fact that I've gotten to meet some of my favorite photographers of all time that I used to take the bus to El Camino Real, get on skate to the bus stop, then take the bus to Tower Records and Books and just sit there and go through the photo selection there and see what the new photo books were. And then to like there was a picture I showed in the slideshow from Sally Mann's house. Like I gotta meet Sally Mann. Like I got an email from Sally Mann. I was so stoked on that. I've got to meet Mark Klett. There's all these photographers who I really just always admired and loved, and that's been the greatest thing about this whole thing. Just getting to know your heroes.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there other photo things you do for fun besides what you're known for?
Oh yeah. I'm actually this book. I'm not gonna say I'm done making this work, but it is kind of like closing the chapter on this, and I'm sitting on a ton of paper that solarizes. So I am solarizing things, and I'm hoping to start getting that work out maybe later this year. And I'm working also with Fuji instant print film that does some interesting things. So yeah, but I am definitely, everybody's doing, you're always got something else on the back burner that you're thinking about. And like this new work, I actually made, the first one I made was right before COVID. And I made one and then I stared at it for about a year. And then slowly, and now I'm kind of all in on that at the moment.
Well, sometimes you have to sit with that project before it
Yeah.
becomes something.
Yeah.
All right, I've got one more chat question and then one question I forgot that I promised someone on Instagram that I would ask.
Okay.
So we'll with the chat question we have. I am an architect, so so now interested in a few comments about your work in architectural photography. A favorite
Oh God.
building, for example.
Oh no, I wasn't an architectural photographer. I was the guy who lugged around the lights and loaded the film holders and made sure stuff didn't catch on fire. And this is back in the film days too. So I was like covering fluorescent tubes with magenta filters and all that stuff. Like, uh, yeah, I wasn't the architectural photographer. That would be Matthew Millman, and I helped Richard Barnes a couple times. But yeah, I'm just got to see some cool stuff. Definitely get that's one rad thing about assisting architectural photographers. You get to go to these homes that you would never be allowed into. Yeah.
So you got to see some cool architecture along the way.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Wild stuff.
Okay, so someone on Instagram mentioned, I guess this isn't really a question, they just wanted me to mention that you play one mean polka accordion. Say that 3 times. Is
I
this
play
true?
a mean accordion.
That's what somebody on Instagram said. Is this
I
not true?
wish. I wish. No, I unfortunately, my mom made me play the piano when I was a little kid for about 5 years, and I think I had a tenor saxophone that had a bunch of punk band stickers on it from junior high, and then I like, you're in jazz band and like, okay, Chris, go, and I had nothing. So I could read the music, but I don't have that. Again, knowing your limitations, like I know I don't know how to design a book. I also know I don't have any musical abilities.
I love that. So that maybe that was another
But
Christmas.
accordion would be awesome. I've always been fascinated by that instrument.
See, I believed it. I was like, I could see that. I thought maybe that was another one of your
Oh,
private.
dude, if I did, I would be playing it for you guys right now. But,
Maybe next time. Maybe next time. Maybe this spawns the idea.
oh, jeez. Yeah, I'll give a photography for the accordion.
I don't know about all that. But you do, I mean, okay, so we'll wrap up with this. If you look at the earliest part of your CV, the earliest noted bibliographies, we're talking about publications surrounding punk rock and skateboarding
Yeah.
and zines. And you talked a little bit about that earlier, in that the skateboarding was what inspired you to build the cameras, that know-how. But would you say that punk rock, skateboarding, and zines still influence your work today?
I wouldn't say it influences me today, except for those early days where, I mean, I don't know. So I used to make this zine called Ankle Bite. My photographs were meant to be photocopied back then. Like I didn't know. I was self-taught, so it was all meant to be just photocopied. And then you'd make a zine and you'd send it to Maximum Rock and Roll or this magazine called Fact Sheet 5. This is all pre-internet. This is the 80s. It'd get reviewed and it'd say send $1 and with my address. I'd go to my mom's house and I'd send out my zine, and in return, I got their zine and whatnot. And that was the internet back then, I think. And so just through that, the doing it yourself thing I got out of that was the biggest connection to the way I'm making work now, I guess.
So yeah, there were some zines predating the other books. So
Yeah.
you published more than 2 books.
Zines don't count.
Yeah. Well, and then there's the limited editions that we need to acknowledge as well.
Oh, for this limited edition for this book.
And then
Yes.
Candela book had a limited edition as well, and each print came with, or each book in the limited edition came with a print that was part of one sequence, from what I recall.
Yeah, because I don't do editions. They're all unique. So the Candela book was a sunrise, little 4x5s, and I think there was 21 of them. So you got a piece of the piece. So they aren't editions. And then for this book, it's a sunrise and a sunrise over San Francisco Bay and a sunset over the Pacific Ocean, with the Poly-Optic with the fly camera, and then I cut those down so you get a piece of a helio. It's like a Poly-Optic heliograph piece.
Well, we could probably talk for another hour or so, but we do need to wrap things up.
Yep.
But thanks so much for joining us, Chris, and for everybody else.
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time.
No, thank you, Chris. We all really appreciate it. And once again, there is a link in the chat to the book if you just want to check it out, or if you want to add one to your collection. I will add that we currently only have a few in stock, but there are more on the way. So if anybody adds it to their cart and it says back order, no worries. We'll have more in stock in 1 or 2 weeks. So there's more on the way. So
and you save on shipping if you go through PhotoEye.
yes, we love Datz, but if you're shipping it all the way from Datz, it's gonna be a little bit more.
Yeah.
And if you're in Santa Fe, come by, look at the actual prints. If anybody has any questions about the books or prints, you can call me at the gallery or email me at gallery@photoeye.com. And thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Have a good evening, everybody. Thanks for listening.